Scotland, and the only route back to Europe for Scotland is for the Scottish independence.
Angus MacNeil.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And a great pleasure and privilege to follow the member for Coatbridge, Christen and Bellsill in an absolute barnstorm of a speech. Excellent. It's been a good debate, Mr. Speaker. And I was to extend a hand, a bit of friendship across the chamber. I was particularly taken by the member of Banff and Buchan, who could at least accept interventions and deal with debate, unlike the Secretary of State for Dumfries and Galloway, who called for debate and sensible debate and serious debate, but wouldn't actually debate. Mr. Speaker, something very interesting happened in this debate here today. The member for Perth and North Perthshire has to be particularly congratulated. In one speech, he got 6 unopposed motions through this Parliament. Now, in 1266, on the 2nd of July 1266, Mr. Speaker, we had the Treaty of Perth, which joined the Hebrides and the Isle of Man to Scotland. But I think after that speech, we can have maybe the statutes of Perth of the 2nd of November 2022, which would have the 6 motions that he got passed in his speech, and the first being a magnificent achievement of having all the parties here agreeing, maybe not the Lib Dems, that as independent Scotland would be a successful independent country. And, Mr. Speaker, we have to see where we are today and our starting point. And as Robert Burns said, to see yourselves as others see you. In the Atlantic magazine, a 165-year-old publication in Washington, D.C. last week, they had an article about the UK, which Scotland is in. And the subject of this interesting article, titled How the UK Became One of the Poorest Countries in Western Europe, were an absolute avalanche of facts and statistics. Some of them, I think, should be put in front of the House today. Behind the lurid headlines, Mr. Deputy Speaker, however, there is a sorry story of decades-long economic dysfunction that holds lessons for the future. The UK, a wealthy nation, that gave a modern capitalism to the industrial world, but strictly by the numbers. Britain is a pretty poor for rich place. Pretty poor for a rich place. UK living standards have fallen significantly behind those of Western Europe. By some measures, in fact, real wages in the UK are lower than they were 15 years ago, and are likely to be even lower next year. To see yourselves as others see you. Under the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, markets were deregulated, unions smashed, and the financial sector emerged as a jewel of Britain's economy. However, Thatcher's injection of neoliberalism had complicated knock-on effects. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, it hit hard, smashing the engine of Britain's economic ascent. Weary of deficits, the British government pursued a policy of austerity, the folly of George Osborne, fretting about debt rather than productivity and aggregated demand. The results were disastrous, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I could go on, but I would commend the article to anybody to read exactly what has been said about the UK from this influential American publication. And it is so unlike what is going on in Ireland and the other countries that we've mentioned that are ahead of us in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries in the Human Development Index. We live in a state basically that governs for London. And they say in a final excerpt, I'll read from them, take out Greater London, the prosperity of which depends on an uncomfortable degree on a willingness to provide services to oligarchs in the Middle East and the former Soviet Union. The UK is one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. We live in a state that governs for London and governs for nowhere else, and demands that the rest of us should be grateful. There is no meaningful engagement with other parts of the UK. Last week, the University of Parma in Italy published a report from my constituency in Hillingen and Year. The report was titled Migrants as Actors of Scottish Rural Depopulation. It called for 2 things in their extensive study: the removal of the English language skills, a barrier to people coming to work, making it not an entry condition but an integration goal. And as we've seen in the Hebrides, people who do come do learn English. Some even learn words of Gaelic. And it is amazing what actually happens on the ground outside the fantastical thinking of the Home Office, and deal with an occupation list that shows up regional needs. They can do this in Switzerland. We can do this in the UK. If we lived in a proper union, the Home Office wouldn't be a faraway Home Counties office. We would need to beseech the Home Office, send letters to the Home Office, or meet with a revolving door of immigration ministers at the Home Office. We would not need to send delegations to the Home Office. The Home Office would come to us to find out what the problems were and to try and deal with those problems. The fact is, the Home Office and the UK government are not interested. Migrants, as we know, are important. A small stat that was in the report The 3% of migrants that we were lucky to have come to Nehiling in a year contributed 7% of our island births. Our island's future depends on them, our culture depends on them, our lives in the islands depend on them going forward, but the Home Office is not interested. Scotland and the UK will see a population decrease. It is expected to fall 2%, and some might think this is a unique Scottish problem, but it's not. When we see the difficulties we have around about us, we understand why. The UK is failing. Now, our neighbours in Ireland, when Scotland will see a decrease in the next 30 years, will see an increase of 20%. Our neighbours in Iceland will see their population increase by 32%. Our neighbours in Norway will see their population up by 13%. And the neighbours in Denmark will see the population go up by 10%. All this is illustrative of no matter what they say about the statistics, the UK is failing Scotland, and is particularly failing rural Scotland. And the best example of this, the most geographically isolated of all the places, the Faroe Islands, over the same period, will see their population rise by 6%. We need to have something done about this, and the only thing that can happen that's going to make a material difference is to take control of these matters, in the way Iceland has, in the way Norway has, in the way Denmark has, in the way everywhere sensible has, and therefore we will see our population grow. It is absolutely reprehensible that we have a Labour Party that will go shoulder to shoulder with Better Together and denude and degrade the rural populations of Scotland, because they do not care. Quite simply, they do not care at all. Now, a number of people will ask then, when we say where we need to go with Scotland, what are we going to do, how are we going to finance it? They never point out or realise that the UK has not paid its own way for 70 to 80 years. In fact, of all the monies borrowed in the last 70 to 80 years, it has only paid back 1.7% of that. The UK has been failing. In Margaret Thatcher's years, one of the people who misleads and beguiles the Tory party, for 9 of her 11 years, she ran a deficit. And if it wasn't for the subsidy of Scottish oil, she would have probably run a deficit for 11 of those 11 years. Because £1 in every 12, 8%, she had a bonus for tax revenue of 8% coming from Scotland's natural resources, which she squandered, and that party squandered, unlike what happened in Norway when that money was saved for the good of the people. Now, very soon, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are going to have the Supreme Court deciding on what happens in Scotland. And it's very likely that the Scotland Act of 1998 does not have the powers for the Parliament to hold a referendum. And that will leave us with a choice of whether we wait to have a Westminster election, because we will have a ballot box event deciding on Scottish independence, whether it's a referendum or an election, or we have a Holyrood election, or we engineer an election at Holyrood itself with one simple question on Scottish independence and get ourselves safe and away from these economic extremists, these pile of economic extremists that we have at the United Kingdom Parliament and the United Kingdom Government. That is a debate for us internally, and it's a debate for Scots, and I hope we have that debate and hope we decide rationally and collectively together on which way we will choose when I think, as I probably likely will, that the Supreme Court will say the powers do not exist to have a referendum under the Scotland Act. We have ways after that, we have options after that. But people here who object to Scotland deciding and think Scotland doesn't have its right to self-determination are going to be sorry and be very disappointed. We will have our say. The people of Scotland can speak. They will speak. Democracy is not a one-term event. Democracy demands that after the events of 2016, when Scotland was taken out of the EU against its will, that Scotland shall speak and Scotland shall decide, and none of us can say no to the people. Nobody can say to a nation, you will go this far and no further. Because if Scotland wants to go further, Mr Deputy Speaker, Scotland will, and it will go to independence. Thank you.
Well, that was another long 7 minutes, wasn't it? But exactly.